The diary was lying open on his desk. Arthur Miller had left it there when he stepped out to take a phone call, and Marilyn Monroe, standing in the doorway of his Connecticut study, bringing him coffee like the good wife she was trying so hard to be, saw her name on the page. She knew she shouldn't read it, knew that private thoughts written in private journals should remain private. But her name was right there, in her husband's distinctive handwriting, and she couldn't look away. She set down the coffee cup with trembling hands and moved closer to the desk. What she read in those next 60 seconds would haunt her for the rest of her life. It had started so beautifully, so promisingly. June 1956, a small Jewish ceremony in Westchester County. Marilyn Monroe marrying the intellectual playwright Arthur Miller. The press called it the marriage of beauty and the brain. Marilyn called it her chance to finally be taken seriously. After Joe DiMaggio had wanted her to quit acting and become a housewife, after countless studio executives had treated her like a beautiful object with no thoughts worth considering, Arthur Miller represented something different. He was a serious artist, a Pulitzer Prize winner, a man who read Dostoevsky and debated philosophy, a man who, she believed, would value her intelligence as much as her beauty. She'd fallen in love with his mind first. They'd met years earlier briefly, but reconnected in 1955 when Marilyn had moved to New York to study at the Actors Studio. She was trying to transform herself, to become a real actress, to prove she was more than the dumb blonde Hollywood had created. Arthur was everything Hollywood wasn't: sophisticated, intellectual, serious about art. He took her to museums and Broadway shows. He introduced her to his literary friends. He listened when she talked about books, about her desire to play serious dramatic roles. For the first time in her life, a man seemed to see Norma Jean instead of just Marilyn Monroe. "You're so much smarter than anyone gives you credit for," Arthur had told her during their courtship, and those words had meant more to her than any compliment about her beauty ever had. She'd spent her entire life being dismissed as a pretty face, being told she was too beautiful to be intelligent, being cast in roles that required her to play dumb. But Arthur saw through that. Arthur understood. Arthur would help her become the artist she knew she could be. Or so she thought. The wedding itself was complicated. Arthur's mother didn't approve, not of Marilyn's career, not of her image, not of her 3 divorces. His children from his first marriage were confused and hurt. The press was relentless, turning their private ceremony into a circus. And there was the tragic moment when a photographer died in a car crash while pursuing them for wedding photos, a death Marilyn would feel guilty about for years. But despite all that, Marilyn was hopeful. She was Mrs. Arthur Miller now. She was the wife of one of America's greatest playwrights. Surely now people would see her differently. Surely now she'd be taken seriously. The first few months were good. Arthur was working on a screenplay for her, something serious and dramatic that would showcase her actual talent. They lived in his Connecticut farmhouse, and Marilyn played at being a country housewife, cooking dinners and tending to his needs. She was trying so hard to be what she thought he wanted: intellectual, cultured, worthy of being his partner. She read the books he recommended, discussed the plays he mentioned, tried to engage with his friends on their level. But underneath, she was terrified. Terrified that she wasn't smart enough, that she'd say something stupid, that they'd all realize she was just a foster kid from Los Angeles who'd barely finished high school. And then came that day in the study. That moment when she saw her name in his diary. That moment when everything changed. The entry was dated just a few weeks into their marriage, and it was about a party they'd attended with Arthur's intellectual friends. Marilyn had been nervous, trying so hard to fit in, to say the right things, to prove she belonged in Arthur's world. And apparently she'd failed. Because there, in black ink in her husband's handwriting, was the word that would echo in her mind for years: disappointing. Arthur had written about how Marilyn had embarrassed him at the party, how she'd said something he found foolish in front of his friends, how she wasn't as intellectual as he'd hoped, how her attempts to engage in serious conversation came across as naive and shallow, how she was ultimately disappointing. Not the woman he'd thought he was marrying, Not the equal partner he'd imagined. Just another beautiful woman who couldn't quite live up to the standards of his sophisticated social circle. But the most shocking part was still coming. Because it wasn't just one entry. As Marilyn stood there, frozen, unable to look away, she saw more. More entries about his disappointment. About how tiring it was to deal with her insecurities. About how her chronic lateness and anxiety were frustrating. About how he sometimes wondered if he'd made a mistake. About how the woman the world saw as the ultimate sex symbol was, in his private thoughts, fundamentally inadequate as an intellectual companion. She heard his footsteps returning and quickly moved away from the desk, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her chest. Arthur came back into the study, picked up the coffee she'd brought, thanked her absently, and returned to his typewriter. He had no idea what had just happened. No idea that his wife had just read his private thoughts, and that those thoughts had shattered something fundamental inside her. She smiled, nodded, and left the room. And in that moment, something in Marilyn Monroe died. The word disappointing became a poison that infected everything. Every conversation after that, she wondered if he found her disappointing. Every time she spoke up about books or politics or art, she second-guessed herself. Was she embarrassing him again? Was she proving him right? Every party with his friends became torture, waiting for the moment she'd say something stupid and see that look in his eyes, that confirmation that she wasn't good enough for his world. The worst part was that she couldn't confront him about it. How could she admit she'd read his private diary? How could she explain that his private thoughts had wounded her more deeply than any public insult ever had? This is exactly where everything changed. Because Marilyn Monroe had survived a lot of cruelty in her life. She'd survived foster homes and sexual abuse and exploitation by powerful men. She'd survived Joe DiMaggio's jealousy and the studio system's objectification. But this was different. This was the man she'd married because she thought he saw her differently, proving that he saw her exactly the same way everyone else did, as fundamentally lacking, fundamentally inadequate, fundamentally disappointing. The betrayal wasn't that he'd cheated on her or left her. The betrayal was that he'd never really respected her at all. Their marriage began to unravel slowly, like a sweater with one loose thread. Arthur grew more distant, more critical. Marilyn grew more insecure, more dependent on pills to sleep and pills to wake up and pills to get through the day. She desperately wanted to get pregnant, thinking a child would fix things, would prove she could be a good wife, would make Arthur love her the way she needed to be loved. But she had 3 miscarriages during their marriage, each one devastating, each one another failure in her mind. Another disappointment. Arthur finished the screenplay he'd been writing for her, The Misfits. It was supposed to be his gift to her, a serious dramatic role that would prove her talent. But when Marilyn read it, she saw something that terrified her. The character Arthur had written for her, Rosalind Tabor, was damaged, fragile, emotionally unstable, desperately needy. Was this how he saw her? Not as the intelligent woman trying to be taken seriously, but as a beautiful broken thing who needed to be managed and pitied? The screenplay that was supposed to be a love letter felt more like a diagnosis. The filming of The Misfits in 1960 was a nightmare that everyone on set witnessed. The marriage was clearly over, even if they hadn't officially acknowledged it yet. Marilyn was hours late to set every day, sometimes not showing up at all. Arthur was cold and distant, rewriting scenes without consulting her, treating her more like a difficult actress than his wife. The Nevada heat was brutal, and the atmosphere on set was even more suffocating. Clark Gable, Montgomery Clift, and director John Huston all watched the slow-motion collapse of the Millers' marriage, unable to do anything but try to keep the production moving forward. You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet, though, because the cruelest irony of The Misfits is that Marilyn's performance in it is brilliant. Despite, or perhaps because of, her personal anguish, she delivers a raw, vulnerable, heartbreaking portrayal that proved everything she'd been trying to prove for years. She was a real actress. She had depth and range. She could do serious drama. Critics who saw the film acknowledged her talent. But by the time the film was released, her marriage to Arthur Miller was over, and her vindication as an actress felt hollow. What good was proving you weren't disappointing if the person you most wanted to impress had already decided you were? The divorce was finalized in January 1961, after 4.5 years of marriage. The public reason given was incompatibility. But those who knew them understood the real reason. Arthur Miller had married Marilyn Monroe hoping for a muse and an intellectual equal, and Marilyn Monroe had married Arthur Miller hoping for validation and respect, and both had been disappointed by reality. The difference was that Arthur had the luxury of documenting his disappointment in private, while Marilyn had to live with the knowledge that the man she'd trusted most had been quietly judging her inadequate. Wait a minute. Don't miss this detail, because the aftermath of this marriage affected Marilyn in ways that went beyond just another failed relationship. The diary incident, that word disappointing, became embedded in her psyche like shrapnel. It confirmed her deepest fear about herself, that she was fundamentally inadequate, that no amount of beauty or fame or effort would ever make her good enough. Joe DiMaggio had wanted her to be less than she was, to quit her career and become a traditional wife. But Arthur Miller had wanted her to be more than she could, to somehow transcend her background and her insecurities and become the sophisticated intellectual partner he'd imagined. Both. Expectations were impossible. But Arthur's failure to accept her for who she actually was, not dumb, but not academically trained, not shallow, but not part of his literary elite, not stupid, but not equipped with the cultural education his social circle took for granted, that failure hurt in a way Joe's jealousy never had. Because Joe had at least loved Norma Jean. Arthur had fallen in love with the idea of what Marilyn could become. And when she remained stubbornly, humanly herself, he'd been disappointed. Friends noticed the change in Marilyn after the marriage ended. She was more fragile, more dependent on medication, more convinced that she was unlovable. Arthur was supposed to be different, she told her friend Susan Strasberg. He was supposed to see me for who I really am. But he just saw another version of Marilyn Monroe. Not sexy enough for some people, not smart enough for him. I can't win. The resignation in her voice was heartbreaking. She'd tried so hard to bridge the gap between Norma Jean and Marilyn Monroe, between the foster kid and the movie star, between the woman she was and the woman everyone wanted her to be. And she'd failed. The saddest part is that Arthur Miller probably never understood how deeply he'd hurt her. Men like Arthur Miller, educated, privileged, sophisticated, often don't realize how much power their judgments hold. To him, writing in his diary that his wife had disappointed him at a party was just processing his own feelings, trying to work through the complications of his marriage. He didn't intend for her to read it. He didn't mean to crush her spirit. But intention doesn't matter when the damage is done, and the damage was profound. Years later, after Marilyn's death, Arthur Miller would write about their marriage in his autobiography and in various interviews. He portrayed himself as a man who'd tried to help a troubled woman, who'd done his best but couldn't save her from her demons. He talked about her lateness, her pill dependency, her emotional volatility, all the things that had made her difficult to live with. And maybe those things were true, but what he rarely acknowledged was his own role in her suffering. How his disappointment, his judgment, his inability to accept her as she was, had contributed to her sense of inadequacy. He did admit, eventually, that the misfits had been difficult for Marilyn. She felt exposed by it, he said in one interview. But even in that admission, there was a lack of understanding. She didn't just feel exposed. She felt betrayed. The screenplay was supposed to prove his faith in her talent, but instead it felt like a dissection of all her flaws, all written by the man who knew her most intimately and who'd promised to love her. The intellectual betrayal, in some ways, was worse than if Arthur had simply had an affair. If he'd cheated on her with another woman, it would have hurt, but it would have been understandable, familiar, just another man unable to remain faithful to Marilyn Monroe. But this was different. This was the man whose respect she'd craved more than anything. The man she'd married specifically because she thought he valued her mind, revealing that he found her intellectually inadequate. It struck at the core of her deepest insecurity. Marilyn Monroe had grown up in foster homes, barely educated, never given the cultural advantages that Arthur Miller's children took for granted. She'd had to fight for everything, for safety, for love, for recognition. And when she'd become famous, she'd tried desperately to educate herself, to read the right books, to learn about art and theater and philosophy. But she was always playing catch-up, always aware that she lacked the foundation that people like Arthur had received as their birthright. And despite all her efforts, despite all her studying and striving, she'd been found wanting by the one person whose approval she needed most. You won't believe this, but there's a layer to this story that makes it even more tragic. Because Arthur Miller, for all his intellectual sophistication, failed to understand something fundamental about Marilyn Monroe. She wasn't dumb. She wasn't shallow. She wasn't the airhead she played in movies. She was intelligent in ways that didn't fit into his academic framework. She was emotionally intelligent, artistically intuitive, deeply empathetic. She understood human nature, understood performance, understood how to convey complex emotions through the subtlest changes in expression or voice. She could analyze scripts and characters with remarkable insight. She just couldn't discuss Hegel or debate political theory or engage in the kind of intellectual posturing that passed for conversation at Arthur's dinner, parties, and maybe that's the real tragedy here, that Arthur Miller, celebrated for his ability to write complex human characters, couldn't see the complexity in his own wife. He saw her insecurity and neediness, but not the strength it took to survive what she'd survived. He saw her lack of formal education, but not her hunger to learn. He saw her emotional volatility, but not the trauma underlying it. He wanted a sophisticated companion who happened to look like Marilyn Monroe. What he got was Marilyn Monroe, brilliant and damaged, beautiful and insecure, talented and self-destructive, and he found her disappointing. The last time they saw each other was during the filming of The Misfits. By then, the divorce was inevitable, just a matter of paperwork. Marilyn was barely functional, arriving late or not at all, struggling through scenes while heavily medicated. Arthur watched from behind the cameras, still rewriting, still trying to perfect the film even as everything else fell apart. There's footage from the set showing them in the same frame, but carefully avoiding eye contact. Two people who'd once been in love now unable to even look at each other. The distance between them was more than physical. It was the distance between who he'd wanted her to be and who she actually was. And that distance had proven unbridgeable. When Marilyn died in August 1962, less than 2 years after their divorce, Arthur Miller was one of the people notified. He didn't attend the funeral. Joe DiMaggio had made sure to exclude most of Hollywood, including Arthur. But in the days after her death, reporters asked Arthur for his reaction, his memories, his assessment of Marilyn Monroe. And even then, in death, he couldn't quite let go of his disappointment. He spoke of her talent, yes, but also of her troubles, her difficulties, the ways she'd made life hard for those around her. It was a complex assessment, probably fair in many ways, but it lacked something essential, any acknowledgement of his own failures as her husband, his own contribution to her suffering, his own inability to love her as she needed to be loved. Decades later, Arthur Miller married again. This was his third marriage. His new wife, photographer Inge Morath, was intellectual, sophisticated, cultured. She spoke multiple languages, had a university education, could discuss art and philosophy with ease. She was, in many ways, everything Marilyn had tried so hard to be. And Arthur seemed happy with her in a way he'd never been with Marilyn, which only confirms what Marilyn had feared all along. She hadn't been enough. The problem hadn't been Arthur Miller's capacity to be happy in marriage. The problem had been her inadequacy as a partner. At least that's how she would have seen it. But here's an alternate interpretation, one that Marilyn couldn't see because she was too trapped in her own insecurity. Maybe the problem wasn't that she was inadequate. Maybe the problem was that Arthur Miller couldn't love anyone who didn't fit his preconceived notion of what an intellectual partner should be. Maybe his failure wasn't about her lacking something, but about him lacking the flexibility and empathy to appreciate different kinds of intelligence, different kinds of worth. Maybe Marilyn Monroe was never going to be enough for Arthur Miller, not because she wasn't enough, but because his expectations were fundamentally unfair. The diary entry, that word disappointing, represented everything wrong with how the world treated Marilyn Monroe. She was constantly measured against impossible standards. Too sexy for serious roles, not intellectual enough for sophisticated company, too damaged to be loved unconditionally, too needy to be a good partner. Everyone wanted her to be something other than what she was. And the tragic irony is that what she was, a complicated, struggling, brilliant, broken human being doing her best to survive and create art despite enormous obstacles, was actually remarkable. But no one, least of all Arthur Miller, seemed capable of appreciating that. In his autobiography, published years after Marilyn's death, Arthur Miller wrote extensively about their marriage. He portrayed himself sympathetically, the serious artist who'd tried to help a troubled woman, who'd been patient with her difficulties, who'd created a role specifically for her talents. And maybe he believed that narrative. Maybe he genuinely thought he'd been a good husband, that the marriage failed because of her issues, not his. But what's missing from his account is any deep reckoning with how his judgment, his disappointment, his failure to accept her as she was contributed to her suffering. Marilyn Monroe didn't need another person telling her she wasn't good enough. She'd heard that message her entire life, from foster parents who sent her back, from studio executives who wouldn't let her choose her own roles, from critics who dismissed her as just a pretty face, from a culture that objectified and diminished her. What she needed was someone who could see past all the noise, all the expectations, all the images of who Marilyn Monroe was supposed to be, and love Norma Jean, the actual woman with all her flaws and all her strengths. Arthur Miller couldn't do that. And that failure of empathy, that inability to love her as she was rather than as he wanted her to be, broke something in her that never healed. The word disappointing might seem small. Just one word in one diary entry, but words have power, especially when they come from someone whose opinion matters more than anyone else's. That word confirmed Marilyn's worst fear about herself, that underneath the beauty and the fame and the new Lee, she was fundamentally inadequate, not enough, a disappointment. And once that belief took root, it was nearly impossible to dislodge. Every subsequent failure, every problem, every difficulty became evidence supporting that central conviction. I am disappointing. I am not enough. I will never be enough. What you've seen is nothing compared to the psychological damage of being found inadequate by someone who promised to value you. Arthur Miller broke Marilyn Monroe in a way that's hard to quantify or explain. He didn't hit her. He didn't publicly humiliate her. He didn't cheat on her, as far as anyone knows. What he did was worse in some ways. He privately judged her and found her wanting, and she discovered that judgment accidentally and had to live with it silently. It was a betrayal of the most intimate kind, a violation of the trust that marriage requires, and it left scars that lasted until her death. If there's a lesson in this tragedy, it's about the danger of expectations, about the cruelty of measuring people against impossible standards, about the importance of accepting people as they are rather than as we wish they were. Marilyn Monroe was never going to be the sophisticated intellectual partner Arthur Miller wanted. But she was brilliant in her own way, emotionally intelligent, artistically gifted, courageously vulnerable. If Arthur had been able to see and value those qualities instead of focusing on what she lacked, their story might have ended differently. But he couldn't. And so Marilyn spent 4.5 years trying desperately to become someone she wasn't, failing, and internalizing that failure as proof of her fundamental inadequacy. The saddest part is that Marilyn Monroe's performance in The Misfits, the film that represented both Arthur's gift to her and his final judgment of her, is genuinely brilliant. Watching it now, knowing the context, you can see her pouring all her pain and confusion and desperation into the role, Rosalind Tabor, the character Arthur wrote, is damaged and needy and emotionally raw, but Marilyn made her real, made her sympathetic, made her human. She proved, one final time before their marriage ended, that she was a talented dramatic actress capable of complex emotional work. And Arthur Miller watched those dailies, saw that performance, and still found her disappointing. That's the tragedy. That's the betrayal. That's the heartbreak that Marilyn Monroe carried with her until her death 18 months later. Which city are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever been called disappointing by someone whose opinion mattered to you? Should Arthur Miller have accepted Marilyn as she was? Or did she need to change? Is it worse to be judged physically or intellectually? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Boulevard of Monroe for more stories about the hidden pain behind Hollywood glamour, the betrayals that cut deepest, and the human cost of impossible expectations. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next story.